Captain Sarah Martinez had always been the subject of whispered conversations and barely concealed smirks throughout her military career. At 32, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slight frame that made her standard-issue uniform appear oversized. Her colleagues often joked that she looked more like someone who belonged in a library than leading soldiers into battle. What they didn't know was that behind her quiet demeanor and unassuming appearance lay a tactical mind that had graduated top of her class from West Point and earned 3 commendations for strategic excellence in overseas operations. The 3rd Infantry Battalion had been without proper leadership for 6 months following a scandal that rocked the entire base. Colonel James Harrison, their former commanding officer, had been court-martialed for misappropriation of funds and inappropriate conduct with subordinates. The battalion, once known for its discipline and efficiency, had devolved into a collection of cliques and informal power structures. Senior sergeants ran their own little kingdoms, junior officers played politics instead of focusing on their duties, and morale had plummeted to dangerous levels. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Stevens, the interim commander, had tried his best to maintain order, but he lacked the authority and respect needed to truly lead the unit. The soldiers had grown comfortable with the relaxed atmosphere, showing up late to formations, treating equipment carelessly, and engaging in behavior that would have been unthinkable under proper military discipline. The base had become a place where practical jokes were more common than proper training exercises, and where soldiers spent more time in the recreation center than on the training grounds. When news broke that a new commanding officer had been assigned, the speculation began immediately. The soldiers gathered in small groups during mess hall conversations, placing bets on who would be chosen to lead them. Most assumed it would be a grizzled veteran, probably someone with combat experience who could whip them back into shape through sheer intimidation. Others hoped for someone lenient who would maintain the current relaxed environment they had grown accustomed to. Sergeant First Class Tommy Rodriguez was particularly vocal about his expectations. A 10-year veteran with multiple deployments, he had become something of an unofficial leader among the enlisted men. His broad shoulders and commanding voice made him a natural figure of authority, and many soldiers looked to him for guidance more than they did their actual officers. Rodriguez had made it clear that he expected the new commander to be someone he could respect, someone who had earned their position through blood, sweat, and battlefield experience. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning during the weekly formation. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens stood before the assembled battalion, his weathered face showing the strain of the past months. The soldiers stood in loose formations, their uniforms wrinkled, boots unpolished, and attitudes casual. It was clear that military bearing had become more of a suggestion than a requirement. Stevens cleared his throat and began reading from an official document. The new commanding officer would be Captain Sarah Martinez, recently returned from a classified operation in Eastern Europe. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Suppressed chuckles rippled through the ranks, and soldiers exchanged knowing glances. Many had heard of Martinez, the small woman who worked in intelligence and strategic planning. She was known more for her paperwork than her presence, and the idea of her leading a combat battalion struck many as absurd. Private Johnson, a young soldier fresh out of basic training, whispered to his friend about how his drill sergeant would have laughed at the idea of following orders from someone who looked like she belonged in an office rather than on a battlefield. The comment spread quickly through the ranks, and soon the entire battalion was buzzing with jokes and speculation about their new pocket-sized commander. The date was set for the following Monday when Captain Martinez would officially assume command. The ceremony would be formal, attended by base leadership and visiting officials, but the soldiers were already planning how they would test their new leader. Some talked about seeing how far they could push the boundaries of military protocol, while others wondered if she would even be able to maintain order during her first formation. Rodriguez gathered his most trusted soldiers that evening in the barracks. The conversation was frank and direct. He expressed his concerns about following someone who had never led soldiers in real combat situations. His years of experience had taught him to respect only those leaders who had proven themselves under fire, and Martinez's background in intelligence didn't impress him. He made it clear that respect would have to be earned, and that a small woman with no combat leadership experience would have to work twice as hard to gain his approval. The jokes continued throughout the week. Soldiers created mock formations where the shortest person available would play the role of their incoming commander. They practiced exaggerated salutes and imagined scenarios where they would have to look down to make eye contact with their leader. The atmosphere became increasingly casual as the soldiers convinced themselves that their new commander would be easy to manipulate and unlikely to enforce strict military standards. What none of them knew was that Captain Martinez had spent the previous 3 years leading special operations teams in some of the most dangerous regions in the world. Her small stature had actually been an advantage in covert operations, allowing her to blend into civilian populations and gather intelligence that larger, more obviously military personnel could never access. She had coordinated successful missions that saved countless lives and had earned the respect of elite special forces operators who judged people solely on their competence and results. Martinez had also spent considerable time studying the 3rd Infantry Battalion's recent history. She understood the challenges she would face and had developed a comprehensive plan to restore discipline and morale. Her approach would be methodical and strategic, focusing on building genuine respect rather than demanding it through intimidation. She knew that her appearance would initially work against her, but she also knew that sustained excellence would eventually overcome any preconceptions. The Friday before her arrival, Martinez visited the base quietly to observe the battalion's current state without being noticed. What she saw confirmed everything she had read in the reports. Soldiers wandered around without purpose, formations were sloppy, and there was a general air of complacency that would be dangerous in any real combat situation. She watched Rodriguez holding court with a group of soldiers, clearly operating as an unofficial leader, and she made mental notes about the existing power dynamics she would need to navigate. Her observations also revealed several soldiers who were clearly frustrated with the current situation. She noticed a few junior officers who tried to maintain standards despite the overall atmosphere of relaxation. She saw enlisted personnel who completed their duties properly even when others were cutting corners. These individuals would become her allies in rebuilding the battalion's culture, and she began planning how to identify and empower them. The weekend passed quickly, with soldiers enjoying what they assumed would be their last days of relaxed military life. Many expected that even if their new commander tried to impose stricter standards, they could resist or ignore changes they didn't like. The informal leadership structure that had developed during the months without proper command had created a sense that soldiers could pick and choose which orders to follow. Sunday evening brought a mixture of anticipation and amusement throughout the barracks. Soldiers shared final jokes about their incoming commander and made casual bets about how long she would last before requesting a transfer to a desk job. The general consensus was that someone of her apparent background and physical presence would quickly become overwhelmed by the challenge of leading a combat unit and would either adapt to their relaxed culture or leave. As Monday morning approached, the battalion prepared for what they expected to be an easy transition to leadership they could largely ignore. The jokes were ready, the casual attitudes were firmly in place, and most soldiers had convinced themselves that their new commanding officer would be more of a figurehead than a real leader. They had no idea that their lives were about to change dramatically, and that the small woman they were preparing to dismiss would soon command their complete respect and transform them back into the elite fighting force they were meant to be. The stage was set for a confrontation between expectation and reality, between prejudice and competence, between the comfortable mediocrity they had grown accustomed to and the excellence that would soon be demanded of them. Captain Sarah Martinez was about to show them that true leadership comes not from physical intimidation or battlefield stories, but from competence, intelligence, and an unshakable commitment to bringing out the best in every soldier under her command. Monday morning was coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. Monday morning arrived with an unusually crisp autumn air that seemed to carry a sense of anticipation across the base. The change of command ceremony was scheduled for 0800 hours, and soldiers began gathering on the parade ground with their typical casual approach to military formations. Uniforms were still wrinkled, boots remained unpolished, and the overall appearance of the battalion reflected the months of relaxed standards they had grown comfortable with. Captain Sarah Martinez arrived at 0730, 30 minutes before the ceremony, driving herself in a standard military vehicle. She had deliberately chosen not to make a grand entrance, instead preferring to observe how the battalion conducted itself when they thought no one important was watching. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the unit's condition. Soldiers stood in loose approximations of formation, chatting casually and paying little attention to their surroundings. From her position near the base headquarters building, Martinez watched Sergeant Rodriguez moving through the ranks like he owned the place. His interactions with the soldiers were more like a civilian supervisor than a military leader, and she could see that he had clearly established himself as the real authority figure in the absence of proper command. Other non-commissioned officers seemed to defer to him, and even some junior officers appeared to seek his approval before making decisions. The ceremony itself was attended by Colonel Robert Wade, the base commander, along with several other high-ranking officials who had come to witness the transition. Martinez had specifically requested that the ceremony be kept simple and professional, avoiding any unnecessary pageantry that might further emphasize her physical differences from traditional military leaders. She understood that her first impression would be crucial, and she wanted that impression to be based on competence rather than spectacle. When Martinez finally stepped into view of the assembled battalion, the reaction was exactly what she had expected. Subtle smirks appeared on faces throughout the formation, and she could see soldiers nudging each other and whispering comments. Some tried to hide their amusement, while others were less subtle in their skepticism. She had faced similar reactions throughout her career, and she had learned to use their underestimation as an advantage. Colonel Wade conducted the ceremony with military precision, reading the orders that officially transferred command of the 3rd Infantry Battalion to Captain Martinez. The words carried weight and authority, but Martinez could see in the faces of her new soldiers that they heard only the formality without absorbing the significance. They were going through the motions of accepting new leadership while mentally preparing to test and challenge her authority. Martinez's first address to the battalion was deliberately brief and understated. She thanked Colonel Wade for his confidence in her abilities, acknowledged the service of Lieutenant Colonel Stevens during his time as interim commander, and then turned her attention to the soldiers themselves. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying easily across the formation despite her small stature, but she kept her remarks focused on practical matters rather than inspirational speeches. She announced that there would be a company commanders meeting at 1,000 hours, followed by a battalion-wide formation at 1,400 hours where she would outline her expectations and immediate priorities. She also stated that she would be conducting individual meetings with all senior non-commissioned officers over the following week, starting with the senior enlisted leadership that afternoon. Her tone was professional and matter-of-fact, giving no indication of anger or disappointment with the current state of the unit. The ceremony concluded without incident, and soldiers began dispersing back to their regular duties with the same casual attitude they had maintained throughout the morning. Many felt relieved that their new commander seemed as non-threatening as they had expected, and the jokes resumed almost immediately. Private Johnson commented to his friends that she seemed nice enough but probably wouldn't last long trying to run a real military unit. What the soldiers didn't realize was that Martinez was conducting a detailed assessment of everything she observed. She noted which soldiers maintained proper military bearing even when their peers were being casual. She identified junior officers who showed signs of frustration with the current standards. She observed the informal power structures and communication patterns that had developed in the absence of proper leadership. During the company commanders' meeting, Martinez met with the 4 officers who led the battalion's individual companies. Captain David Chin commanded Alpha Company, Captain Lisa Thompson led Bravo Company, Captain Marcus Williams was in charge of Charlie Company, and Captain Jennifer Hayes commanded Delta Company. These officers had been struggling to maintain any semblance of military standards within their units while dealing with the overall atmosphere of complacency that had infected the entire battalion. The meeting revealed the depth of the problems Martinez would need to address. Captain Chen reported that his soldiers routinely showed up late for formations and training exercises, with little consequence for their actions. Captain Thompson explained that equipment maintenance had become sporadic at best, with soldiers treating expensive military hardware carelessly because they faced no accountability for damage or neglect. Captain Williams shared his frustration with the informal leadership structure that had emerged, where soldiers looked to Rodriguez and other senior enlisted personnel for guidance rather than following the proper chain of command. Captain Hayes described incidents where soldiers had openly questioned orders and refused to complete assigned tasks, knowing that there would be no meaningful consequences for their insubordination. Martinez listened carefully to each report, asking specific questions about particular incidents and individuals. She was building a comprehensive understanding of the battalion's problems while simultaneously assessing the capabilities and commitment of her company commanders. What she discovered was that these officers were competent leaders who had been undermined by the lack of support from higher authority during the months of interim leadership. She also learned that there were soldiers within each company who maintained professional standards despite the overall environment. These individuals had become frustrated and demoralized watching their peers get away with behavior that would have been unacceptable in a properly functioning military unit. Martinez made note of these soldiers as potential allies in her effort to rebuild the battalion's culture. The afternoon formation at 1,400 hours drew a larger crowd than the morning ceremony, as word had spread throughout the base about the new commander's arrival. Soldiers gathered with the same casual attitude, expecting another brief and forgettable speech from someone they had already dismissed as ineffective. The formation was sloppy, with soldiers standing in rough approximations of proper positions and continuing conversations even as Martinez approached. Martinez took her position in front of the formation and waited. She said nothing for several long minutes, simply observing the soldiers and letting the silence build. Gradually, conversations died out as soldiers began to realize that their new commander was not going to speak until she had their complete attention. The silence became uncomfortable, then tense, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. When Martinez finally spoke, her voice carried clearly across the formation, but her words were not what anyone expected. Instead of inspirational rhetoric or threats of discipline, she began reciting specific details about recent training exercises and equipment readiness reports. She mentioned incidents by date and unit, describing failures and shortcomings with precise accuracy that demonstrated she had done her homework thoroughly. She spoke about weapons that had been improperly maintained, training standards that had been ignored, and safety protocols that had been violated. Her information was so detailed and accurate that soldiers began to realize she knew far more about their recent performance than they had assumed possible. The casual attitudes began to shift as they understood that their new commander had been studying them carefully. Martinez then shifted to discussing the battalion's history and reputation. She spoke about their distinguished service record, their previous achievements, and the pride that soldiers who had served in this unit before them had earned through their dedication and professionalism. She made it clear that the current state of the battalion was not just disappointing but actually dishonored the memory of those who had served with distinction in the same unit. Her words were not delivered with anger or frustration, but with a quiet intensity that was somehow more compelling than shouting would have been. She spoke about potential rather than failure, about expectations rather than punishment, about the opportunity to rebuild something that had been temporarily lost rather than starting over from scratch. The formation ended with Martinez announcing specific changes that would begin immediately. Physical training would resume the following morning at 0530 hours, with full participation required from all personnel regardless of rank. Equipment inspections would be conducted weekly, with detailed reports submitted to her office. All soldiers would undergo refresher training on basic military protocols and procedures, starting with proper formation and drill movements. She also announced that she would be implementing an open-door policy where any soldier could request a private meeting to discuss concerns or suggestions. However, she made it clear that this policy came with the expectation that problems would be addressed through proper channels before requiring her personal attention. As soldiers dispersed from the formation, the atmosphere had changed noticeably from the morning's casual confidence. There were fewer jokes and more serious conversations about what the new commander might actually be capable of accomplishing. Some soldiers remained skeptical, but others were beginning to reconsider their initial assumptions about Captain Martinez. Rodriguez gathered his usual group that evening, but the conversation was different from previous days. Instead of dismissing their new commander as irrelevant, they found themselves discussing the specific details she had mentioned about their recent performance. The accuracy of her information had caught them off guard, and they were beginning to realize that she had been observing and evaluating them more carefully than they had realized. The real test would come in the following days, as Martinez began implementing her plans to restore military standards and discipline. The soldiers had grown comfortable with their relaxed environment, and changing established patterns would require sustained effort and unwavering commitment. But the foundation had been laid, and the process of transformation was about to begin in earnest. The first physical training session under Captain Martinez's command began at 0530 hours on Tuesday morning, and the turnout was disappointing but not surprising. Less than half the battalion appeared at the designated assembly area, with many soldiers either oversleeping or simply choosing to ignore the new requirement. Those who did show up arrived in a mixture of proper PT uniforms and civilian workout clothes, clearly testing to see if their new commander would enforce uniform standards. Martinez appeared precisely on time, dressed in regulation PT gear with every detail perfect. Her appearance immediately highlighted the casual approach most soldiers had taken to their own uniforms. She said nothing about the poor attendance or improper dress, instead beginning the session with basic calisthenics that gradually increased in intensity. What surprised the participating soldiers was that despite her small frame, Martinez easily kept pace with the most physically fit members of the unit. The workout progressed through a series of exercises that tested not just physical strength but mental toughness and teamwork. Martinez led from the front, demonstrating each movement with perfect form while maintaining a running commentary about proper technique and safety considerations. Her knowledge of physical fitness principles was clearly extensive, and she pushed the soldiers harder than they had been challenged in months. By the end of the session, even the most skeptical participants had to admit that their new commander was in excellent physical condition and knew how to conduct effective training. Several soldiers who had expected to outlast her found themselves struggling to keep up, while Martinez finished the workout looking barely winded. The display of physical competence began to chip away at some of the preconceptions about her capabilities. Word spread quickly through the battalion about the morning's events. Soldiers who had skipped the session received detailed reports from their friends about Martinez's unexpected performance. The stories grew with each telling, but the basic facts remained consistent. Their small, quiet commander was tougher than she looked and had demonstrated a level of physical fitness that impressed even the battalion's most athletic soldiers. The first equipment inspection was scheduled for Thursday morning, and Martinez spent Wednesday conducting her own preliminary assessment of the battalion's gear and weapons. What she found confirmed the reports she had received from the company commanders. Weapons were dirty and improperly maintained, vehicles showed signs of neglect, and expensive equipment was being stored carelessly with no apparent concern for its condition or readiness. Martinez documented everything she observed with photographs and detailed notes. She wasn't preparing to punish anyone for the current state of the equipment, but she wanted a clear baseline from which to measure future improvements. Her approach was methodical and professional, focusing on establishing standards rather than assigning blame for past failures. The inspection itself revealed the extent to which military discipline had deteriorated during the months without proper leadership. Soldiers presented weapons that hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks, uniforms that looked like they had been slept in, and personal equipment that was missing basic required items. Many seemed surprised that Martinez was conducting a real inspection rather than a superficial review. What caught the soldiers off guard was Martinez's detailed knowledge of every piece of equipment she examined. She identified problems that previous inspectors had missed, pointed out maintenance issues that could become serious safety concerns, and demonstrated a technical understanding of military hardware that far exceeded what anyone had expected from someone with her background. Private Williams, a mechanic who had grown careless about maintaining his assigned vehicle, found himself being questioned about specific components and procedures that he had forgotten. Martinez not only identified the problems with his work but explained exactly why proper maintenance was critical for operational readiness. Her knowledge was so comprehensive that Williams later admitted to his friends that he learned more about his job during that 10-minute conversation than he had in the previous 2 months. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had attended the inspection expecting to see Martinez overwhelmed by the technical details, instead found himself being educated about advanced maintenance procedures he hadn't considered. When she identified a potential safety issue with one of the weapons in his care, he realized that her expertise went far beyond what he had assumed possible for someone who had never served in a traditional combat role. The individual meetings with senior non-commissioned officers began Friday afternoon, starting with Rodriguez himself. He entered Martinez's office with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, prepared to evaluate whether this small woman deserved his respect and cooperation. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours and fundamentally changed his perspective on his new commanding officer. Martinez began by asking Rodriguez about his background, his experience with the battalion, and his observations about the unit's current strengths and weaknesses. She listened carefully to his responses, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she understood the complexities of enlisted leadership and the challenges he faced in maintaining morale during the period of interim command. What impressed Rodriguez most was that Martinez treated him as a professional colleague rather than a subordinate to be lectured. She acknowledged his experience and expertise while making it clear that she expected him to be part of the solution to the battalion's problems. She outlined specific ways she planned to utilize his leadership skills and asked for his input on strategies for rebuilding discipline and morale. The conversation revealed that Martinez understood military culture far better than Rodriguez had expected. She spoke knowledgeably about the informal power structures that had developed in the battalion, the importance of peer influence among enlisted personnel, and the need to balance authority with respect for experience. Her approach demonstrated that she saw leadership as a partnership between officers and non-commissioned officers rather than a top-down hierarchy. By the end of the meeting, Rodriguez found himself committed to supporting Martinez's efforts to rebuild the battalion. Her combination of competence, respect for his experience, and clear vision for the unit's future had earned something he hadn't expected to give: his genuine respect. He left the office prepared to use his influence among the enlisted personnel to support rather than undermine the changes she was implementing. The weekend provided an opportunity for soldiers to reflect on the first week under their new commander. The initial jokes and casual dismissal had given way to more serious discussions about what Martinez might actually accomplish. Physical training attendance had improved significantly by Friday, and soldiers were beginning to take equipment maintenance more seriously after seeing the depth of her knowledge during inspections. Captain Chen reported to Martinez that morale in Alpha Company was beginning to improve as soldiers responded to having clear expectations and consistent leadership. The soldiers who had been frustrated with the previous lack of standards were particularly enthusiastic about the changes, while those who had preferred the relaxed atmosphere were grudgingly adapting to new requirements. Captain Thompson noted that her soldiers were asking more questions about proper procedures and techniques, indicating that Martinez's demonstrations of expertise were motivating them to improve their own knowledge and skills. The competitive atmosphere that was developing around meeting the new standards was having positive effects on overall performance and attitude. The second week began with a full battalion formation where Martinez announced additional changes to training schedules and operational procedures. Her presentation was detailed and comprehensive, addressing specific deficiencies she had observed while outlining concrete steps for improvement. The soldiers listened with an attention and respect that would have been impossible to achieve during her first day of command. Martinez also announced the implementation of a merit-based recognition system that would acknowledge soldiers who demonstrated exceptional performance or improvement. This wasn't just about rewarding existing high performers but about encouraging others to raise their standards and compete for recognition. The system was designed to rebuild the culture of excellence that had been lost during the months of ineffective leadership. The most significant change was the announcement of upcoming field training exercises that would test the battalion's readiness for real-world missions. Martinez explained that these exercises would be conducted under realistic conditions with clear performance standards and measurable objectives. The training would be challenging but fair, designed to build confidence and competence rather than simply test endurance. Sergeant First Class Maria Gonzalez, a communications specialist who had maintained high standards throughout the period of interim leadership, approached Martinez after the formation to express her appreciation for the changes. She explained that many soldiers had been frustrated with the lack of meaningful training and the absence of recognition for professional performance. The new leadership was providing exactly what dedicated soldiers needed to thrive. The conversation with Gonzalez revealed another dimension of the problems Martinez was addressing. She learned that several of the battalion's most competent soldiers had been considering transfers to other units because they were discouraged by the low standards and lack of professional development opportunities. The new leadership was not just about fixing current problems but about retaining the talented personnel who would be essential for long-term success. As the second week progressed, the transformation of the battalion became increasingly visible. Physical training sessions were reaching full attendance, equipment inspections revealed steady improvement in maintenance standards, and soldiers were beginning to take pride in their appearance and performance. The change was gradual but unmistakable, and even the most skeptical soldiers had to acknowledge that something significant was happening. The jokes that had characterized the battalion's initial reaction to Martinez had stopped completely. In their place was a growing sense of professional purpose and mutual respect that had been missing for months. Soldiers who had initially dismissed their new commander were beginning to understand that she represented something they had forgotten they were capable of achieving: excellence in military service and pride in professional accomplishment. The foundation for real transformation had been established, but the most challenging tests were still ahead. Martinez knew that changing attitudes and improving basic standards was just the first step in rebuilding a truly effective military unit. The upcoming field exercises would reveal whether the improvements were superficial or represented genuine change in the battalion's capabilities and culture. The field training exercise was scheduled for the third week of Martinez's command, and preparation began immediately after her announcement. Unlike the casual approach that had characterized previous training under interim leadership, every detail was meticulously planned and communicated to all participants. Martinez established clear objectives, specific performance standards, and detailed evaluation criteria that would measure both individual and unit effectiveness. The exercise scenario involved a simulated combat mission requiring the battalion to secure a strategic objective while operating under realistic constraints of time, resources, and enemy opposition. Martinez had designed the training to test not just basic military skills but also leadership, teamwork, and adaptability under pressure. The opposing force would be provided by personnel from other units on the base, ensuring that the challenges would be genuinely demanding. Preparation revealed how much the battalion had improved in just 2 weeks under Martinez's leadership. Soldiers approached equipment checks and briefings with a seriousness that had been absent for months. Weapons were properly maintained, communications equipment was tested and ready, and personal gear was organized and complete. The transformation in basic military readiness was remarkable and visible to everyone involved. Rodriguez had emerged as a key ally in preparing for the exercise, using his influence among the enlisted personnel to ensure that everyone understood the importance of the upcoming test. His endorsement of Martinez's leadership carried significant weight with soldiers who had initially been skeptical of their new commander. The partnership between officer and non-commissioned officer that Martinez had cultivated was proving essential for effective unit leadership. Captain Chen reported that Alpha Company was approaching the exercise with enthusiasm rather than resignation. Soldiers were asking detailed questions about tactics and procedures, seeking to understand not just what they were supposed to do but why particular approaches were most effective. The intellectual engagement demonstrated a level of professional interest that had been missing during the period of declining standards. The night before the exercise, Martinez conducted a final briefing for all company commanders and senior non-commissioned officers. Her presentation was comprehensive and detailed, covering every aspect of the mission from initial deployment through final extraction. What impressed the assembled leaders was not just the thoroughness of her planning but the sophistication of her tactical thinking and her ability to anticipate potential complications. Captain Thompson asked about contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop during the exercise, and Martinez demonstrated that she had already considered multiple alternatives for every major decision point. Her responses revealed a depth of tactical knowledge that went far beyond what anyone had expected from someone with her background in intelligence and strategic planning. The exercise began at 0400 hours with a deployment phase that tested the battalion's ability to organize and move efficiently under time pressure. Martinez had established specific timelines for each stage of the operation, and she monitored progress from a command post that provided her with real-time information about every element of the mission. Her communications with company commanders were precise and helpful, providing guidance without micromanaging their decisions. The first major test came when Alpha Company encountered unexpected resistance while attempting to secure their assigned objective. The opposing force had established a stronger defensive position than the initial intelligence had suggested, and Captain Chen found himself facing a tactical problem that required creative solutions. Instead of providing direct orders, Martinez asked questions that helped him think through the situation and develop his own approach to overcoming the obstacle. Chen's solution involved coordinating with Bravo Company to create a diversionary attack while his own forces approached the objective from an unexpected direction. The maneuver required precise timing and effective communication between multiple units, testing the battalion's ability to execute complex operations under pressure. Martinez monitored the action carefully but allowed the commanders to implement their plans without interference. The success of the coordinated attack demonstrated that the improvements in training and leadership were translating into real operational capabilities. Soldiers who had been operating as individuals or small groups during the months of interim leadership were now functioning as an integrated team capable of complex military operations. The transformation was evident not just in their tactical performance but in their confidence and professional bearing. Sergeant Gonzalez, operating the communications center for the exercise, reported to Martinez that message traffic was professional and efficient, with units maintaining proper radio discipline and following established protocols. The contrast with previous training exercises was dramatic, reflecting the renewed emphasis on military standards and attention to detail that had characterized the past 3 weeks. The second major challenge occurred when Delta Company's advance was slowed by simulated casualties that required medical evacuation and tactical reorganization. Captain Hayes faced the dual challenge of maintaining operational momentum while ensuring proper care for wounded personnel. Martinez observed how Hayes balanced these competing priorities, noting her calm decision-making and effective use of available resources. The medical evacuation phase tested not only tactical procedures but also the battalion's ability to maintain operational security while dealing with wounded personnel. Martinez had specifically included this scenario to evaluate whether soldiers would maintain discipline and focus during emotionally challenging situations. The professional response demonstrated that the unit's improvement extended beyond basic military skills to include the mental toughness required for real combat operations. Private Johnson, who had been among the most skeptical soldiers during Martinez's first days of command, found himself serving as a team leader when his squad's senior member was designated as a casualty during the exercise. The responsibility forced him to apply the training and leadership principles he had learned during the previous weeks, and his performance exceeded his own expectations. The experience gave him new confidence in his abilities and appreciation for the value of proper military training. The climax of the exercise came when all 4 companies had to coordinate a simultaneous assault on the primary objective while maintaining security for their supply lines and communication networks. The operation required precise timing, effective leadership at multiple levels, and seamless integration of different tactical elements. Martinez monitored the action from her command post, ready to intervene if safety required it but committed to allowing her soldiers to succeed or fail based on their own performance. The assault succeeded through a combination of careful planning, aggressive execution, and adaptive problem-solving when unexpected complications arose. Charlie Company overcame a communications failure by implementing backup procedures they had practiced during recent training. Bravo Company compensated for equipment malfunction by redistributing resources and adjusting their tactical approach. The flexibility and competence displayed by all units exceeded the performance standards Martinez had established for the exercise. The after-action review revealed the extent of the battalion's transformation during the 3 weeks since Martinez assumed command. Soldiers participated in detailed discussions about tactical decisions, operational procedures, and individual performance with an enthusiasm and professionalism that would have been impossible to imagine during the first days of her leadership. The review process itself demonstrated that they had internalized the principles of continuous improvement and professional development. Rodriguez spoke during the review about the difference between going through the motions of military training and genuinely preparing for real-world missions. He acknowledged that the battalion had been engaged in the former during the months of interim leadership, while the recent emphasis on standards and competence had restored their focus on the latter. His comments carried particular weight because of his respected position among the enlisted personnel. Captain Williams reported that Charlie Company's soldiers were asking when they could participate in more advanced training exercises, indicating that the successful completion of this exercise had built confidence and created appetite for greater challenges. The enthusiasm was exactly what Martinez had hoped to achieve by demonstrating that high standards led to better performance and greater satisfaction. The formal conclusion of the exercise included a ceremony where Martinez recognized outstanding individual and unit performance during the training. The recognition was based on specific achievements and measurable contributions rather than general praise, reinforcing the principle that excellence would be acknowledged and rewarded. Several soldiers who had initially been skeptical of Martinez's leadership received awards for their performance during the exercise. Colonel Wade attended the closing ceremony and observed the battalion's transformation during his brief remarks. He noted that the unit's bearing, competence, and professional attitude had improved dramatically since Martinez assumed command. His public recognition of her accomplishments served to validate the changes she had implemented and demonstrate higher command's support for her leadership approach. The success of the field exercise marked a turning point in the battalion's culture and capabilities. Soldiers who had initially dismissed Martinez based on her appearance and background now spoke of her with genuine respect and admiration. They had learned that true leadership was measured not by physical presence or intimidating demeanor but by competence, fairness, and commitment to bringing out the best in every member of the unit. The jokes that had characterized the battalion's initial reaction to their new commander had been replaced by pride in professional accomplishment and confidence in their collective capabilities. Martinez had demonstrated that a small woman with the right combination of knowledge, dedication, and leadership skills could transform a demoralized unit into an effective military organization. The transformation was complete, but it was also ongoing. Martinez understood that maintaining high standards required constant attention and continuous effort. The success of the field exercise was not an endpoint but a foundation for even greater achievements. The battalion had rediscovered its potential for excellence, and Martinez was committed to helping them reach new levels of professional competence and military effectiveness. As soldiers returned to their regular duties following the exercise, they carried with them a renewed sense of purpose and pride that had been missing for months. They had proven to themselves that they were capable of exceptional performance when properly led and challenged. The experience had transformed not just their military capabilities but their understanding of what they could accomplish when they committed themselves to excellence. The woman they had initially underestimated had become the leader they needed, and the unit they had allowed to deteriorate had become something they could be proud to serve in. The jokes had stopped permanently, replaced by the serious business of professional military service and the satisfaction that comes from being part of an organization that demands and achieves the highest standards.